Good evening, dear friends. It's Thursday, and you are watching English Without Borders series of webinars. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. John Miglietta, who has been doing several webinars with us like since last week. And before I give the floor to Dr. Miglietta, I'd like to give you some brief introduction. So Dr. John Miglietta is a Fulbright Fellow in Tajikistan for 2021 and 2022. And he received his Ph.D. in politics from New York University in 1995. And he's a professor of political science at Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee. So his research areas are international security, American foreign policy, as well as Middle East and Central Asian politics. Today, Dr. Miglietta will be talking about the significance of theory and variables. So it's a very interesting topic, especially for those who are teaching students at universities and college, and who are teaching research classes, and those who are planning to apply for master degree programs. This presentation will be really helpful. I'm happy to give the floor to Dr. Miglietta, who will give more information about this topic. Thank you, and I'll give it to Dr. Miglietta.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I want to thank English Without Borders for sponsoring this talk and for inviting me to come speak. The topic of my presentation today is going to be, and I'll give you the exact title, The Significance of Theory and Variables in Research. And we're going to be examining the research process. And we're going to talk about the significance of theory. We're going to talk about the significance of variables and give some examples and talk about some strategies for effective research, both for researchers and for people teaching research. So let's get into what is a theory. Well, again, all research starts with some kind of a theoretical framework. A theory is a well-substantiated explanation of an aspect of the natural world that can incorporate laws, hypotheses, and facts. Theory explains known facts, but allows predictions of what should be observed or what could be observed. It is easier to apply theory in the physical sciences because there are laws of nature. For example, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Assuming you're on Earth, essentially, and you're not in a vacuum or anything like that. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. We know that. That's kind of a law of science. It's a scientific fact. In the social sciences, theory is a little bit more difficult to establish, as there are exceptions and mitigating factors. And you can't really have everything equal, because there's always going to be different extraneous facts coming in, or different aspects or different variables that you can't necessarily factor in all of them. So in analyzing theory, it is very, very important to define your terms and understand that these can sometimes be open to interpretations. And a little bit later on in the talk, when I get into the examples, I'll kind of focus on this a little bit, and you can kind of see what I mean specifically. Theory provides the ability to develop patterns in the interpretation of data. So rather than just taking a lump of data and just looking at each thing individually down the list, you basically try to put it into patterns. You're trying to predict, in the case of social science, you're trying to predict some aspect of human behavior. Whether it's how people vote, how people think about politics, how people think about their society, etc. Theory provides a linkage between research studies. Often this is how researchers interact with each other. they're trying to prove or disprove a theory.
Excuse me, Dr. Miglietta,
Yes.
we can't see the slides. We only see the.
Oh, did I not share it? I'm sorry. Oh, shoot. All right, let me share it. I thought I did that. I'm sorry. There we go. You're seeing them now? No. Why are we not seeing them?
Yes, we can see.
Oh, we are seeing them. Okay, good. All right, good. So let me just, well, okay, yeah, we didn't really miss too much from the earlier slide, so I won't bother going back, but, or should I? Should I go back? No? Okay. So as I said, theory provides the ability to develop patterns in the interpretation of data. It provides a linkage between research studies. Again, social scientists or, whoever is doing the research, they're trying to prove or disprove a theory, or in some cases, refine a theory. This is how people build on the work of others. This is part and parcel of the research process. You're continually building on the research of previous researchers, essentially, the work of previous researchers. And you see this in science, you see this in physical sciences, you see this in the social sciences, history, literature, etc. Theory provides a framework to develop concepts and variables. I'm going to talk a little bit about variables in a few minutes. Theory allows the interpretation of findings for the theorists, as well as those researchers that will continue researching the topic. And again, if you look at any discipline, you're often dealing with theories that people developed maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and they still have some relevance today. One of the types of theories that I often deal with in my work and in my teaching, because I teach international relations, is theories of war and conflict. In international politics, there's been a great deal of research on trying to predict wars in the international system. Why is a war likely to break out in certain situations and not in others? So to do that, a group of researchers got together and formed something known as the Correlates of War Project, or COW, if you want to, just have a short version of the name, Correlates of War Project. And what the function of this research study is to gather data on every conflict since 1815 in an effort to quantify why do some conflicts lead to war but not others? Why does war break out in some instances but not in others? In other words, what are the conditions necessary to make war likely? One of the criteria they established for a war is 1,000 battlefield deaths within a 12-month period. So they examined another criteria of what is exactly a war? Because again, war is often a term that's often misused, and things are called wars, and they're really more like skirmishes or cross-border raids. There's not really a systemic level of hostilities. So one of the criteria they established, okay, to really consider a conflict a war, there has to be 1,000 battlefield deaths within a 12-month period. Now that may seem rather arbitrary. What if there's only 995? Is it not a war? I mean, you almost had 1,000. So again, but you have to, again, about 1,000 battlefield deaths, but you have to have some kind of a cutoff. However, not all conflicts lead to war. There are many conflicts that are not considered wars, yet they have the same characteristics as wars. So again, that's something, again, as I mentioned earlier, in the physical sciences, you have these hard and fast rules. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. You drop an object on Earth, it's going to fall because of gravity. I mean, you can't really get around that. But social science, history, it's a little harder because you have a lot of extenuating circumstances and conditions. The changing nature of warfare is another thing that social scientists and historians have to factor in. What we call a war, what traditionally was called a war, doesn't happen that much anymore, right? Traditionally, countries would mobilize their resources and populations to fight each other. sometimes joining with other countries in various alliances. And there'd be a formal declaration of war. It would be very legalistic. And here I have like a series of Venn diagrams on the alliance system leading up to World War I. So you see the different overlaps and alliances between the various powers or most of the various major powers of the day. Today, you do not have many state-to-state wars, by and large, with a few exceptions. Most of the conflicts are internal within a state, within a country, and the threat is it's going to spill out into other neighboring countries. That's, if you look at Central Africa, if you look at maybe parts of Asia, this is the type of scenario that you're seeing that could lead to conflict among several states. Not so much two states going to war, but internal conflicts within a state that sort of spill over into the region. So again, the way we look at war has kind of changed because the way countries act regarding conflict has changed to some degree or another. Conflict occurs because of issues internal to a country or countries, and it spills over into other countries. Conflicts can also occur when states break up, which has happened in the international system in the last 20 or 30 years. And again, sometimes it's relatively amicable, like Czechoslovakia, what was referred to as the Velvet Divorce, where they basically the Czechs said, we'll go our way, you go your way. And not that they, haven't had any like small problems, but they didn't really have, it was a very amicable split. There was no major conflict. Or you could have Yugoslavia, where you had major conflicts over territory and ethnicity and ethnic cleansing and all these other sorts of things. And other instances are kind of somewhere in the middle. They didn't come out as well as the Czech Republic, Slovakia case, but they weren't quite as bad as the former Yugoslavia. Likewise, you can have conflicts because of revolutions and internal conflicts within the country. And the most recent example of that is Libya in 2010, 2011. And that has reverberations, not just in Libya, but throughout West and Central Africa as well. The significance of variables in theory construction. A variable is something that is thought to influence or be influenced by something else. That is essentially what a variable is. The independent variable in a research study is something that is constant. So in other words, that is the thing that's constant. That is the thing that's always there. The independent variable affects the dependent variable, which is the subject of the research study. So this is something I try to get across to my students when they're doing research papers. In your introduction, define what your research question is. Define what your variables are. Because everybody wants to tell the story, and that's a good thing, right? Because we have to, in history and political science and literature, we have to talk about the topic and we have to set the stage. But we also have to identify, look, this is what we're trying to prove. This is what we're trying to measure. And we do that by clearly identifying variables, particularly the independent and the dependent variables. Variables are linked together by hypothesis. This is what you are thinking the outcome of the study might be before you start the research. This is what you think is going to happen. It may happen, it may not happen. And again, scientists do this all the time. They think, okay, if we do this and do this, we're going to get this other thing. And they run through all kinds of experiments, and sometimes they get it, and sometimes they don't. And if they don't, then they have to tweak the experiment a little bit until they come up with something that finally they get the desired outcome. They get the outcome they think they're going to get, whether it's producing a vaccine or whether it's producing, something else. They often have to tweak it. And the same thing is true with other disciplines. We say, okay, maybe this didn't work out this way. Why didn't it work out? Maybe we need to adjust our variables a little bit or take into account these other factors. that for whatever reason we weren't taking into account the first time around, or the second time around, or the third time around, as the case may be. So for example, an example I like to use in class, if there was a research study attempting to identify the likelihood that governments change as a result of external conflict, then the hypothesis would be war as a likely cause leading to changes in government. So if we want to then identify our variables, the independent variable would be war or conflict. Now, again, as we mentioned in the previous slides, we have to be careful, especially in modern times, how we're defining a war, because the definition of war and the practices of war have undergone a certain degree of change from, let's say in the last 100 years or so, or even in the last 50 years or so, since World War II, essentially. The dependent variable is governmental change. So the research may rely on a broad series of quantitative data, like the Correlates of War project, or they can utilize specific in-depth case studies, right? That is a favorite method, particularly of historians and social scientists. You're looking at case studies. Sometimes you're just looking at one case study, and sometimes you're looking at a series of case studies, and you're trying to compare them to see what they have in common. And are there certain things in all the case studies that are in common? And again, sometimes it's hard to make that connection, or the connection is not apparent in all cases. The advantages of case studies are that it allows the researcher to discuss a case fairly comprehensively. The drawback for researchers is that case studies can be fairly time consuming. If you're writing a major research project in political science or history, and you're using 3 different case studies, then you have to research the history, you have to research the politics of it, etc. And that can be rather time consuming if you're trying to do a very, very thorough job. The result of this study would be to identify then what characteristics are present that are caused by war that can lead to governmental change, although it may or may not do so 100% of the time. So, let me go. I'm sorry, let me go back. I jumped ahead a little too much. Let me share again. I'm sorry. So the example I use, and I'm sorry, I thought I had a slide here about that, but the example I often like to use is a work from sociology and political science called States and Social Revolutions by Theda Skocpol. She is a Harvard sociologist and political scientist, and in the 1980s, she wrote a book that I think is still considered a classic, called States and Social Revolutions. And what she did was she examined the role of why she wanted to ask the question, why do revolutions occur? And why do revolutions occur when they occur? Because it's one thing to say, oh yeah, there's going to be a revolution, there's going to be this, there's going to be that, or whatever, or saying that, say, the Russian Revolution was inevitable. But why did it occur when it occurred? Why didn't it occur 20 years earlier or 20 years later? What set of circumstances were in play in 1917, 1918 that led to the Russian Revolution? And she did several. And she did, let's see. And she did several revolutions. She studied several revolutions. She did the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and the French Revolution. I'm going to stop sharing again, and we'll try to do this again. Okay, maybe now. Okay, so basically, her central focus of her thesis was that what this all had in common was that revolutions occurred as a result of a war. Because she looked at the French Revolution, you had France was involved in a lot of conflict right before the French Revolution in the 1780s. The Russian Revolution, of course, you had World War I. The Chinese Revolution was just in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So her thesis was, well, what you had was warfare weakened the state, weakened the police and military apparatus of the state, and this made them harder to resist pressures for change. So she very much equated warfare with revolutions being successful. And that was her thesis. Now, other people went about trying to, either confirm or maybe to disprove that. And people mentioned, well, what about the Iranian Revolution? Well, that was considered a major influential revolution in 78, 79 that had reverberations outside of one country, but region and globally. There was no war there. And she, in some ways, kind of rethought her own theory, but then other researchers said, well, as I was talking about earlier, you have to kind of redefine what a war is. And in modern times, warfare is not as it was, years ago. And maybe we have to think more broadly about warfare. And it's not just war itself, but it's maybe external pressures on the state, weakening the state's ability to resist, revolutionary movements. So again, this comes about as a result of research. This is how researchers constantly rework things, rework their own theories, or modify theories and refine theories. And again, it comes about, as I mentioned, where you're building on the work of other people. And this happens, again, through the exchange of ideas, through the exchange of writings, through critiquing writings, etc. Writing is a process and a practice. It's very important. Those of you who are researchers, those of you who are teaching research and writing, it's very important to stress to your students the importance of multiple drafts. I know a lot of times, a lot of students don't want to hear that. They want to just write it and be done with it, and that's the end of it. But you really need to go through in multiple drafts. Your first draft is you're kind of just getting your thoughts on paper. You're not even worrying about grammar. You're not even worrying about sentence structure. You just want to get ideas down. And then you kind of shape it and mold it. It's like you have like a bunch of clay in front of you, and now you're sculpting it and trying to get it, just so. You should divide the writing process into stages. And this is what I often stress to students. When a student, complains to me that, oh, we have to do a 12-page paper, that's so long, and whatever. I said, well, think of it this way. If you have a good outline, you've broken up your paper into maybe 5 or 6 major parts. Think of it as 5 or 6 2-page papers that are linked together. And then it becomes a lot more manageable to deal with in terms of time. You could say, okay, it's Monday. By Wednesday, I'm going to have part 1 done, or at least a rough draft of part 1. By Friday, I'm going to have a rough draft of part 2. And if you're writing, maybe 2, 2.5, 3 pages, it's manageable chunks. So stress that to your students, and maybe that will make it easier for them if they think of it that way. Because like anything else, you're thinking, oh, I got to write 12 pages, 15 pages. It seems like a lot, but if you're managing it into like 2 or 3 page installments, again, maybe it's not so much. Stages of writing often overlap. Writers actively seek feedback from readers and use this in the revision process. Okay. Again, this is why academics go to conferences. and try to publish papers in journals because they want that feedback. And that's very, very important. Going to conferences is very important. I know with COVID, we're doing a lot of virtual conferencing now, but that is still a plus because you get feedback from your audience. You get feedback from the panel chairs and discussants and the other people on the panels. And that helps you refine your work. So you can get it ready for publication to send to a journal as part of a manuscript or something like that. So again, feedback is very important. And I tell students, this is something I do, maybe not every professor does this, but I say, look, if you're not sure about a section of your paper, maybe submit it in ahead of time and I can take a look at it and give you some comments, without grading it. Now, obviously you can't do this, 4 hours before the paper is due. You have to do it in, space several days or a week ahead of time. So it requires a certain degree of planning. Likewise, give it to your roommate to look at, see if they can understand it or if they have questions about it. Having another pair of eyes looking over your paper is always a good thing. If nothing else, they'll catch grammar mistakes, spelling mistakes that maybe you just didn't catch, even if you've read it 3 or 4 times. So that's important. And that's something I always stress. But again, you can't, if you're writing something and it's due in an hour, obviously you can't do that. So again, it's trying to budget your time is really important. Free writing, again, some techniques for writing that people may want to consider using. Free writing creates as much text as possible. Basically, that's like your rough draft. You're just trying to get your ideas down on paper. Because once they're down on paper, you've felt that you've accomplished something, number one, that you're not just sitting there thinking. I mean, yeah, you have to think about it and whatnot, but it's good to get stuff down on paper. It's good to get stuff into the computer and whatnot. So you have it and it's there for you, etc. So it's good to do that. And again, you could always revise it later. That's really important. Revision is very, very important. Brainstorming. Again, brainstorming is kind of related to free writing and mind mapping, in the sense you're trying to give yourself a visual presentation of your topic. You're trying to get all the different aspects down so you can connect them, and then it's a lot easier to go about, the actual writing and writing. Outlining is really important. One of the things I do when I have a research paper class or a class where there's a research paper assignment is I insist the students give me an outline. Usually I ask for a preliminary outline at the beginning of the semester, and then a more detailed outline maybe towards the end of the semester, like a couple of weeks before their project is due. This forces them to get their ideas down on paper and to really develop kind of a step-by-step process how they're going to approach the topic. Now, again, the outline is not sort of wedded in stone, but it's there. Another tactic that people use is often creating a writer's notebook as a way of recording your thoughts, but also it's a way you can reflect on what you have written. And finally, there's the importance of reading. Reading about your topic, trying to get information. There does come a point though where, you've done your research and it's always nice to try to look at 1 or 2 other things, but there comes a point also though where you have to start writing. And if you find other research sources, great, but again, I'm the type of person, I tend to over-research things sometimes. And I spend a lot of time, I need to get this article, I need to get this book or something. And at some point you just have to say, okay, I need to start writing. If I add stuff later on, that's fine. Considering your research topic, how do you go about picking a research topic? Well, you're looking at what knowledge do you have about the topic? What do you want to find out about the topic? What questions do you have about the topic? And then finally, what resources are available? Can you complete this research project with the resources you have available? Or are you going to need very specialized resources? Are you going to need access to public officials? Are you going to need access to archives that are only in maybe one place and may or may not be digitalized? Now a lot of stuff's on the internet, so it's a little bit easier to do research, but not everything. Sometimes you need certain government documents that aren't available on the web. You have to get special permission. You have to go to a central archive. So you physically have to go there and, get permission from people and sit there and read it and take notes or whatever. And that could be a little bit, that could be a little bit time consuming. That could be, raise some difficulties. So again, a lot of what you have available is going to structure how you're doing research and what you're actually trying to examine. And again, I also said the importance of revision. Revision is very, very important. You're constantly trying to revise your research. If you're an academic, you may have editors who are saying, okay, well, we need this revision, journal editors, book editors, whatever. But get into the habit and really try to inculcate that to students, that they need to revise. Revision is a good thing. So in other words, they can't wait until the night before something is due to actually sit down and start doing it. They're going to have to do it in advance, and they should be maybe doing a day or two before it's due, the final revisions, just getting it right, or changing this paragraph, or making sure that there's no spelling or grammar errors and things of that sort. But you're always doing revision. I mean, I've done research projects where I thought, okay, I've already read it 5 times. Lo and behold, I read it the 6th times and I find something I should change. Or I find something that maybe isn't clear and needs to be a little clearer. So, I mean, it's going to happen, and it's a normal thing, but revision is so important. That is, techniques for writing. I think we went over that already. Yeah, the importance of revisions there. Yeah, so we've gone over those already. So that's about all I have right now. I hope this was informative. I hope this was helpful. Does anyone have any questions? I think if you had questions, you can type them in the chat. Again, things to think about when you're doing research. What theory are you trying to prove or disprove, or are you trying to develop your own theory? What are your variables? What is your dependent versus your independent variable? Try to mind map your topic. Get all your facts down, see the connections between them, and this way it'll make it easier to connect all of your research components. And finally, what is your hypothesis, and why is your work going to be significant? What are you trying to prove, and what impact do you hope your work will have? Especially, obviously, if you're a university instructor or researcher, what impact do you hope your work will have? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Miglietta, for this informative webinar. Writing and doing research is, I think it's one of the challenging work that students face. But once you get, once you know the tools and all the tips that you have shared with us, I think students will start to like it. So one of the hardest part for me personally is just to research, the articles, and from peer edited, right, peer reviewed articles, and just the time that I spend on that, I spend quite a lot of time on just finding the reliable and also relevant sources that I can use in my research. And my question is, how many articles do you suggest your students reading to write their research?
Well, I would normally, if I have students in a typical kind of advanced, maybe undergraduate class, I say, doing a research paper, you should try to have 6 to 10 sources at a minimum. Now, again, the sources, I mean, in the old days, we looked at books, and that's pretty much what we had. Or we went and we got journal articles, and journals were bound in volumes, kind of read through and take notes or make a photocopy. We had a photocopy available of the journal article. Now we can find a lot more stuff on database. So if you're doing social science research, JSTOR is a really great database. I use JSTOR quite a lot. And you can get full articles downloaded, and it's very, very hidden. Now, sometimes it's maybe a little bit too much, because now you have so many articles that you spend so much of your time reading, and you don't leave as much time for writing. So that's what I'm saying. At some point, you just have to cut that off and say, okay, I'm going to start writing my paper. If I come up with a great article or an additional source, then that's fine. But at some point, you have to go with what you have. And what I often do is, if I find several articles are very helpful, I look through their footnotes and their bibliographies to see what sources they use, and maybe grab, see if I can locate a couple of those sources. I've gotten a lot of good source material from doing that. Some websites are very good and very academically oriented. Now, again, you have to be careful with websites, because there's a lot of stuff on the web that is half-truths, untruths, etc. But there's some very good academic websites. I mean, if you're doing stuff and getting international statistics, and you should look at the World Bank, you should look at the WHO, you should look at the IMF. These are good sources of statistics, and they're usually pretty readily available, and they're usually relatively up to date, especially if you're trying to sort of generalize globally. Now, sometimes for individual countries, they may not have the most up-to-date information. They may be a year or two behind or something like that. But in general, those are great sources. And again, if you have access to the internet, then you're usually able to get them fairly easily and fairly quickly. So.
Thank you, Dr. Miglietta. You have shared so many nice kind of information, so much nice information, especially about the technique that you mentioned. Like, I also, before, I didn't know that, but when I just got to know more into researching, I understood that, if it's a really good article, then you can see what resources, what articles he or she is referring to, so that you can also go and check. And also, I use another technique, like when I go to Google Scholar, and when I just do some research, I look at how many people cited that, right?
Oh, okay.
So yeah, if I see that this article has been cited by like 200, 700, so I go for that, because I feel like this is something that many people liked. And also go and check.
Yeah, it's certainly worth you taking a look at. Now, again, I mean, you have to evaluate it yourself, because I mean, that's not necessarily. I mean, that's one instance, but you also have to, sometimes the internet, though, you have to be a little careful, because it can be like an echo chamber. So you get something that people, it could be some kind of weird conspiracy theory or something, and people just go to it because they say, oh, this looks interesting, or they cite it saying, well, this is like what not to do or something, and it kind of gives a false sense that, oh, this is something well researched, when it may be, but it may not be. So you always have to kind of examine things yourself, just to make sure it makes sense, because there is, unfortunately, that's what the internet does kind of breed, this idea of fake news and people citing the same 3 or 4 sources that were not accurate to begin with. And it looks scholarly, and you have organizations that have official sounding names, but it may be in somebody's basement or something. You don't know. I mean, that's the thing. So you have to be you have to be a little careful. Just like, with books and journal articles, again, there's some journals that are peer-reviewed journals. There are other journals that are not peer-reviewed journals. And again, you may have some very good articles there, but maybe not as good as the peer-reviewed journals. So,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
just have to look at each thing individually.
So you are teaching the undergrad students, research and maybe also master students. So how long is the research paper for undergrad and for master students?
Well, usually for undergraduates, I say something like 8 to 10 pages, and if maybe they're seniors and it's kind of a capstone course, maybe 15 to 20 pages. But I also told them, me personally, I don't weigh papers. I don't say, well, if you don't make 15 pages, I'm going to downgrade you. If you're 14 pages and you've really done a good job, that's great. But if the assignment's supposed to be 15 pages and you're handing me 7 or 8, chances are you're leaving a lot of stuff out. So again, I always say that's kind of a guideline. If you're a little over or you're a little under, and you've answered the question, you've done what you had to do, then I'm usually fine with it. Now, then again, there may be some professors that say, no, the requirement is it has to be 15 pages, so it has to be 15 pages, and so on. And then students get very creative and they start triple spacing and doing all these other sorts of things. And I was like, I just don't do that. If you're 14 and a half pages and it's supposed to be 15, and you've done your research and you answered the question and it's well written, then it's fine.
Yes. So, and the other challenge is just, to read the articles and how to summarize it, how to paraphrase it. So I think this is also one of the hardest parts. And how do you check against the plagiarism? Do you have any software?
Well, probably sort of what most universities are using is Turnitin, which basically can be put on whatever your learning platform is. And then when you create an assignment, you create it like in Turnitin. So what Turnitin does is, and you could set the settings in various ways, and your university kind of has to pay for the Turnitin license. So there is a cost to it, but again, if the university adopts it, then of course all the faculty can be able to utilize it. And what it does is it'll compare what what is being submitted with how original it is. We'll look at the internet, or we'll look at a depository of papers and say, okay, it's 20% like stuff that's already there, or 10% or 30. And again, sometimes it might be just bibliography and footnotes. And again, you still need to kind of look at the paper itself and read it, and you can compare it, and it'll show you, okay, this was taken from something else. And sometimes it's just the jargon and the language, but sometimes you're seeing whole paragraphs and it's taken from something else. And then that's when you have a chat with the student, basically saying you can't do that. You can't just cut and paste on the internet. And you can arrange it so students can actually see the originality reports themselves. And I tell them, I said, look, if your originality report is coming back like 40, 50%, there's something wrong here, and you need to check that paper and maybe revise it in some way, shape, or form. But then they can see it. Now, you can have them see it, or you can not have them see it. The choice is up to the instructor, but I usually let them see it. I think only good comes from them seeing it, and they can say, look, this is it. Now, again, like anything else, students get really inventive about plagiarism, so you have to be careful. And oftentimes, not oftentimes, I shouldn't say oftentimes, but a few times I've gotten papers that just totally don't make sense. And basically what the student does is they take a paper and they change words around. They use synonyms, but it doesn't make sense. Like, this is like, people don't talk like this. Even if you're not a native speaker of English, you're not going to write like this. Like, you know, or something. I mean, it's just, yeah, you can, it really just jumps out at you that there's something wrong, that this is not quite right. And, you know, it's, yeah, it just, I mean, I tell students, and most of them kind of get the picture. Yeah, they need to do their own work. Occasionally you get one or two who try to take shortcuts, and they're pretty much easily found out, essentially.
So that's interesting. Have you ever had an experience of coming across like the issue of self-plagiarizing, and how do you usually
Self-plagiarizing?
yeah,
Like,
how do you detect that? Like, I mean, the person wrote this paper in the other, you know, course, and he or she is using that in your kind of course,
Yeah.
in this paper,
Yeah.
and it's also kind of self-plagiarizing.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. Well, basically, I very clearly say on my syllabus, you cannot recycle papers, even if, you know, your own work. Go, well, I wrote it for this other class 2 years ago. Yeah, but if this is a different class, you can't. And again, part of Turnitin is you can have it where when students upload a paper, it goes to like a paper depository, and then it checks that depository as well as the internet to see if this, you know, does it match a paper, or does it significantly match a paper that was submitted for another course.
Interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, I have had occasionally students try to recycle papers, and it's, yeah, I tell them they can't do that. So.
Thank you, Dr. Miglietta. So there's a question: could you provide an example of dependent and independent variables on just teaching methodology? Because our teachers, you know,
Right.
Yeah, so making it like closer to our audience, like, you know, an example of.
Well, the example I normally use is that I referenced it in the talk. The book States and Social Revolutions was written in the 1980s by Theda Skocpol. She talks about why do revolutions occur. And her big deal is war, conflict was the catalyst for revolution. So she says basically the independent variable is war, and the dependent variable then becomes revolution. And, you know, war helps to lead to revolution. Another type, there was another study done, and I can't remember, it was a sociological study. I can't remember the author, but he was looking at the issue of suicide. And he said, well, how do we help try to predict if people, you know, would commit suicide? And he did a study, and he got evidence, and he talked about, well, we talked about married people were less likely to commit suicide. And again, I guess his view was that he developed his variables in such a way. He said, well, if you're married, you tend to have more social interaction. There's somebody there. There's somebody you could talk to, somebody you could relate your problems to, and that would necessarily mitigate those problems. Whereas maybe single people, that wouldn't necessarily be there. Now, obviously, not all single people are committing suicide. So, I mean, they have something, obviously, but they said marriage was, you know, one aspect which might mitigate the number of the people committing suicide. So, I mean, correlation between marriage and suicide, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, that's a really interesting.
Those are kind of depressing topics. I know,
yes, yeah. But, you know, these are kind of something that audience can get more experience with. Yes, and they have more kind of hypothesis to go around with. So we have, I think, addressed and we read all the questions from the audience, and I would like to thank you, Dr. Miglietta, for this wonderful session. I'm sure that this is very important, useful for our audience, especially for those who are teaching research and teaching variables, independent variables. I think they're really difficult to kind of differ from each other, but once, as I said in the beginning, you get into writing and doing research, they will seem much easier.
Yeah, and what I try to do with my students is in their outlines, I try to say, be clear what these variables are. And if they're doing a presentation, be clear what your variables are. This should be right front and center in your presentations of your paper, because so many people, you want to go and you want to tell a story, and that's certainly understandable. But you only have a few minutes, so you need to kind of say, this is the purpose of my research. This is what I'm trying to prove. These are my variables, and then I'm going to fill it in with some specific examples.
I think I mean these variables help you even outline your whole research, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like your roadmap, so to speak. And it's almost like almost like a mathematical proof in a way, where you're saying, okay, if you have this, then this leads to this, and I didn't talk about intervening variables, but this leads to this, and then it's going to lead to the dependent variable. Of course, you do have to be very, especially in social science, you have to be very, very specific about your terms and how you're defining your terms. And sometimes terminology can change, or you can interpret it differently. As I mentioned with a Scotch Bowl study, people started to say, well, maybe do you actually have to have a war? Or can you just have some kind of external pressure on the state, which has sort of the same effect as a war? So.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Miglietta. Thank you. English Without Borders really appreciates your time, your efforts, and your commitment doing webinars with English Without Borders. And on behalf of the English Without Borders team and on behalf of our followers, I'd like to thank you again. And we hope for more collaborations. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, dear audience. If you have, if you couldn't, make it watch now, you can watch the recordings on the English Without Borders website, and you can leave your questions there. We can then pass them over to Dr. Miglietta. So thank you for all who joined us today, and good night. Goodbye.